She paid $8 for an abandoned river barge, and in the river town of Cedar Bend, Missouri, in the autumn of 1886, that transaction marked the lowest point in the life of Delphine Archer, who was 39 years old, widowed that same spring, and left with almost nothing after her late husband's business partner, a prosperous banker named Horace Kell, called in a loan she had never known existed and took the family's river freight office, its 2 working skiffs, and the modest house. Behind it, all in a single afternoon, while the sheriff's deputies stood by to see the matter properly concluded, with $8 remaining to her name, sewn carefully into the lining of her one good shawl. Delphine walked down to the public landing where the county was clearing derelict vessels from the shallows, and there she bought a half-sunk, long-abandoned river barge that had been rotting against the bank for 11 years, a purchase the dockmen considered proof that grief could make a fool of even the steadiest woman. She did not know, not yet, that sealed behind the false ballast boards in that barge's flooded cargo hold was a name every soul in Cedar Bend still remembered, a name that would clear a drowned man's ruined reputation, uncover a disaster's true cause, and finally settle a debt the town had owed its poorest families for over a decade. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Archer. If you have ever bought the cheapest, most hopeless thing available simply because it was all you could afford and found later that it held more than anyone could have guessed, tell us in the comments. And please hit that subscribe button, because Delphine's story was written for you. Delphine had grown up not in Cedar Bend but 100 miles upriver, the only daughter of a lockkeeper and river pilot instructor named Augustine Marchand, a careful, watchful man who spent his working life reading the Mississippi's moods for younger pilots still learning to trust their own eyes over their nerves. Augustine raised his daughter at the lockhouse rather than in any proper schoolroom, teaching her, from the time she could barely see over the gauge boards, to read the river the way other fathers taught daughters to read scripture, the color and swirl of water telling her where a sandbar lurked beneath a deceptively smooth surface, the particular hollow sound a hull made when it passed too near a snag, the different pitch of current around a barge riding heavy with cargo compared to one riding light and empty. The river never lies about what's beneath it, Delphine, Augustine used to tell her, guiding her small hand along the gauge marks chalked onto the lock wall, so she could feel for herself how the numbers told a truer story than any pilot's boast. But men reading the river sometimes do, when it suits them to see what isn't there, or to hide what is. Delphine absorbed this the way a child absorbs anything repeated with enough patient love behind it, without yet understanding how completely her father's river reading would one day extend itself, in her own hands, to the reading of ledgers, contracts, and the confident, misleading stories men told about themselves. It was not only water that Augustine taught his daughter to read carefully. He had spent decades among the pilots and boat owners who worked that stretch of river, and he had watched more than one reputation rise or fall on a single voyage's outcome, and watched, too, how quickly a town's collective memory could settle into whatever story was easiest to believe rather than whatever story was actually true. He spoke often of a boiler explosion aboard a freight barge some years before Delphine's birth, a disaster that had killed several deckhands and left the town of Cedar Bend, where the barge had been loading at the time, in a lasting grief that never fully healed, and of how the disaster's blame had settled, in the years since, upon the barge's young pilot, a man remembered only as reckless and overconfident. Though Augustine himself had trained enough pilots to know that boiler failures rarely came from a pilot's error alone and more often from decisions made far from the wheelhouse, in the offices of the men who owned the vessel and decided how much weight and how much risk a boiler could reasonably be asked to bear. A ruined name is the easiest kind of debt to leave unpaid, he told Delphine once, watching the river slide past the lockhouse on some ordinary afternoon, because the man who owes it is rarely the one who has to answer for it. She carried this observation forward without any particular reason to think she would one day need it, the way a person carries any lesson learned early enough to become simply part of how the world worked. She married at 26 to a river freight agent named Thomas Archer, a steady, plain-spoken man who ran a small but respectable cargo forwarding office in Cedar Bend, arranging shipments of grain, hides, and manufactured goods between the river landings and the rail depot that had, by then, begun drawing much of the old river trade away toward faster inland routes. Thomas had gone into partnership some years before their marriage with Horace Kell, a rising Cedar Bend banker who had provided the capital to expand the freight office's warehouse and add a second skiff to its small fleet, a partnership Thomas always spoke of with genuine gratitude. Believing Kell's early investment had been an act of real friendship and faith in a young riverman's prospects rather than the calculated foothold it would later prove to be. For 13 years, Delphine kept her husband's books with the same careful attention her father had once brought to a gauge board, learning to read a column of freight receipts the way she had once read the river's surface and catching, more than once, a supplier's invoice that didn't quite balance, or a warehouse fee that had crept upward without explanation. Discrepancies Thomas always attributed to his partner's carelessness with figures rather than anything more deliberate. Delphine kept her own quieter doubts to herself, for the sake of the marriage and the partnership, though she never entirely set them aside. What she carried forward from all those years, more than any specific skill with numbers or river currents, was her father's abiding conviction, confirmed again and again in her own quiet observation of her husband's accounts, that the surface of any story, like the surface of any river, could look calm and trustworthy while hiding an entirely different truth beneath it, and that a ruined name was very often the easiest kind of debt for the truly responsible party to leave unpaid, so long as someone else's reputation could be made to absorb the cost instead. There was a particular afternoon, not long before her father's own death, when Delphine had watched him refuse to certify a young pilot's crossing because the boy had misread a shifting bar that any careful eye would have caught, and she had asked her father, somewhat impatiently, why he bothered with such caution when the boy protested that the river had always looked the same to him before. Because the river changes even when it looks the same, Augustine had told her. And so does a man's account of himself once there's something in it he'd rather you didn't examine too closely. Your job isn't to trust the look of the thing. Your job is to check the numbers underneath it every single time, no matter how many times before they've come out fine. Delphine kept that lesson close through her wedding, through the birth and loss of a single stillborn son in her second year of marriage. A private sorrow she folded quietly into the rhythms of her days rather than let it unmake her, and through more than a decade of watching her husband's small business grow steady and respectable along the Cedar Bend waterfront. She did not know, in those years of quiet, steady contentment beside Thomas, how soon and how completely she would need her father's old conviction or how entirely it would one day be the only inheritance left to her. The fall arrived swiftly once illness took hold, in the particular way losses often compound once the first domino tips. Thomas died in the spring of 1886, a fever moving through his lungs faster than the county doctor could treat it, leaving Delphine a widow of 39 with what she believed to be a rightful claim to the freight office and its modest holdings, built jointly with her husband over 13 years of honest work. She had not accounted for how thoroughly Horace Kell's old, easy friendship with his partner could curdle once that partner was no longer present to insist upon fair and equal dealing into something considerably less generous toward the partner's widow. Within 6 weeks of the funeral, Kell produced before the county judge a loan agreement, dated some 9 years earlier, purportedly signed by Thomas, acknowledging a substantial debt owed to Kell's bank for the warehouse expansion and the second skiff, a debt Kell claimed had never been repaid despite 13 years of what Delphine knew, from her own careful bookkeeping, had been an entirely successful and self-sustaining business. Delphine knew, with the same certainty her father's hand would have known a false reading on the gauge board, that the debt was invented, for she had tracked every dollar the freight office earned and spent for 13 years, and no such outstanding loan had ever crossed those careful pages, nor had Thomas ever once, in all their years together, hidden so much as a modest expense from her, let alone a debt of that considerable size. But her certainty, as she was rapidly and bitterly learning, weighed nothing against a signature and a respected banker's confident testimony before a judge who had done business with Kell for 2 decades and had met the grieving widow only occasionally at church. The judge found the loan agreement persuasive and gave Delphine 30 days to satisfy the debt or surrender the freight office, its warehouse, its 2 skiffs, and the small house behind it entirely. She spent those 30 days doing everything her father's old instincts told her to attempt. She searched every drawer and strongbox in the house for some scrap of paper that might contradict Kell's loan agreement and found nothing, for a forgery careful enough leaves no obvious trace of the truth it replaces. She asked the handful of dockhands and clerks who had worked for Thomas over the years whether any of them recalled a debt of that size ever being discussed, and found only uneasy silence. For Kell's bank held the mortgage on nearly every warehouse and landing along that stretch of river, and no one wished to risk his displeasure defending a widow against her own husband's trusted partner. She wrote to the State Banking Commission in Jefferson City asking whether any record existed of such a loan's original disbursement and received only a non-committal reply, promising a review that would, she suspected, take considerably longer than the 30 days the judge had allowed her. On the 29th day, having exhausted every path she could think to try, Delphine packed what little remained to her. A single trunk, her father's old river charts, which she had kept all these years for no reason she could have named except that they had been his, and $8 sewn into the lining of her shawl, because she trusted her own pocket less than she trusted her own stitching, and walked away from the freight office she and Thomas had built together, understanding with a grief that had nothing gentle in it that she was now, at 39, entirely without home, husband, or income in a river town where the man who had taken everything from her was widely regarded as its most upstanding citizen. She might have left Cedar Bend entirely, and she considered it seriously for the better part of a week, staying in a spare room the widow of the old dockmaster offered her out of simple charity. But it was during that week, walking the public landing to clear her head of a grief too large and too recent to sit with indoors, that Delphine noticed the county was clearing several derelict vessels from the shallows below the town, long-abandoned hulks that had sat rotting against the bank for years, considered too far gone and too costly to salvage to be worth any serious buyer's attention. Among them, half-sunk and listing badly against the mud bank, sat what remained of an old freight barge, its timbers gray and swollen, its deck long since caved through in places, a vessel the older rivermen still occasionally referred to, in low and careful voices, as the Cordelia, though none of the newer residents of Cedar Bend seemed to know or much care why the name still carried any particular weight at all. Delphine, standing at the water's edge with her father's old charts tucked beneath her arm and $8 representing the whole of her remaining fortune, felt something stir in her that she could not entirely have explained to anyone watching. Perhaps only the plain, practical recognition that a hull, however ruined, might yet be patched and repaired into some kind of modest floating shelter and income. Or perhaps something closer to her father's own old instinct that a story everyone in town seemed reluctant to discuss in any detail was very often a story worth a second, more patient look. When the county's small clearing auction was held that following week, a poorly attended affair since no one considered Cordelia's flooded hulk worth the labor of raising it, the bidding opened and closed at $7 with no other interest at all, and Delphine, with a boldness that surprised the auctioneer more than it surprised her, said 8 and became, to the quiet, pitying amusement of the handful of dockmen present, the new owner of a half-sunk barge that everyone in Cedar Bend agreed was fit for nothing but scrap timber. She spent the following weeks working the Cordelia free of the mud bank with a hired plank and pulley system she rigged herself, drawing on knowledge of river currents and hull mechanics her father had given her decades before, patching the worst of the hull's breaches with pitch and salvaged timber until the old barge, battered but no longer taking on water, could be worked into the shallows near the old dockmaster's landing, where Delphine had taken up temporary residence. It was in the course of clearing out the barge's flooded cargo hold, hauling free the waterlogged ballast stones that had settled against its lower boards for over a decade, that Delphine's hands, moving along the hold's inner wall with the same habitual thoroughness her father had taught her to bring to any inspection, found a section of ballast planking that did not sit quite flush with its neighbors, a seam too regular and too deliberate to have been caused by simple decay. She worked the loose board free with a pry bar salvaged from the barge's own abandoned tool locker, her breath gone shallow with an anticipation she could not entirely name, and behind it, in a shallow compartment built into the hull's original construction and kept remarkably dry despite 11 years of flooding around it, She found a small oilskin-wrapped bundle containing a slim logbook and a single folded document. Its paper damp-stained at the edges, but its careful, practiced hand still, largely legible. She sat on the barge's ruined deck in the pale autumn light and opened the logbook first, finding within its cover, in bold, careful lettering, a name she recognized at once from her father's old stories and from the low, careful way the older rivermen still spoke of the Cordelia even now, the name of her own vessel's final pilot, a young man named Elijah Coombs. The very man Cedar Bend had spent 11 years remembering as the reckless fool whose error had caused the boiler explosion that killed 4 deckhands and scarred the town's memory ever since. Enjoying this story? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. What Delphine read over the following days, working slowly through Elijah Coombs's careful logbook entries and the folded document tucked alongside them, revealed a story considerably different from the one Cedar Bend had settled into believing for over a decade. Coombs had kept a meticulous daily record of the Cordelia's condition throughout his final weeks as her pilot, entries that described, in increasingly urgent language, a boiler he considered dangerously overdue for proper inspection and repair, its safety valve sluggish and its plating showing the telltale discoloration of metal fatigue that any experienced riverman would have recognized as a warning sign demanding immediate attention. Coombs had reported these concerns repeatedly. His logbook made clear to the barge line's owner at the time, a man named Silas Pruitt, who had built a considerable freight and warehouse fortune along that stretch of river and who happened, Delphine now recalled with a slow, cold recognition, to be the very same Silas Pruitt whose granddaughter had married into the Kell banking family 2 decades later, bringing with her a share of the old freight fortune that had, in the years since, helped fund Horace Kell's own rise to prominence in Cedar Bend. Pruitt, according to Coombs's careful entries, had refused each request for repair, citing the expense and the tight shipping schedule the barge line had committed to for that season's grain harvest, instructing Coombs instead to reduce cargo weight slightly and continue running the boiler at reduced but still active pressure rather than lose the days a proper inspection and repair would require. Coombs's final entries, written in a hand grown visibly strained with worry, recorded that he had considered refusing to pilot the vessel further until proper repairs were made, but that Pruitt had made plain, in a conversation Coombs transcribed with careful, damning precision, that any pilot unwilling to run the current schedule would be replaced within the day by someone more amenable, and that Coombs, supporting a young wife and an infant daughter on a pilot's modest wage, had felt he had no real choice but to continue. The folded document accompanying the logbook proved to be a hastily written letter, dated the very morning of the disaster, in which Coombs recorded his intention to file a formal complaint with the River Commission the moment the current run was completed, listing in careful detail every warning he had given and every refusal he had received. A complaint he plainly believed would finally force Pruitt to address the boiler's condition before it caused the very disaster it in fact caused only. Hours later, Coombs had not survived the explosion himself, dying alongside 3 of his deckhands in the very disaster his own careful records showed he had tried repeatedly to prevent, and in the chaotic, grief-stricken aftermath, with the barge line's owner Silas Pruitt offering his own confident account to the River Commission's hurried investigation, blame had settled, with a speed that Delphine now recognized as depressingly familiar, upon the dead pilot who could no longer speak for himself, his caution reframed by Pruitt's testimony as recklessness, his repeated warnings never once mentioned, his young widow and infant daughter left to bear a ruined family name for a disaster that the very logbook Delphine now held proof it had never been his fault at all. Delphine sat with those entries until the light failed entirely, holding 11 years of a drowned man's unfinished defense in her 2 hands, and thought of her father's voice at the lockhouse, watching the river slide past on some ordinary afternoon. A ruined name is the easiest kind of debt to leave unpaid, because the man who owes it is rarely the one who has to answer for it. Silas Pruitt had left that debt unpaid for 11 years, and his family's fortune, quietly woven into the very bank that now controlled Delphine's own ruined fortunes, had only grown in the years since, built in no small part upon a disaster whose true cause its owner had successfully buried beneath a dead man's convenient reputation. She understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the barge she had bought for $8 because nothing else in the world was left to her had been trying, in its own patient, waterlogged way, to keep Elijah Coombs's true account safe until someone patient enough came looking for it, and that she had, without ever intending it, become exactly that person. She did not act rashly, for she understood, from her own bitter and recent experience with Kell's forged loan agreement, exactly how little a plain accusation would accomplish against a family whose fortune and influence had shaped Cedar Bend's banking, warehousing, and civic leadership for more than 2 decades. She spent the following weeks in careful, patient work, first tracing through the county's old newspaper archive the original River Commission's published findings on the disaster, which relied almost entirely on Pruitt's own testimony and made no mention whatsoever of any prior safety complaints, a conspicuous absence that, held up against Coombs's detailed logbook, told its own quiet story of an investigation that had never seriously questioned the barge line owner at all. She sought out, through careful and delicate inquiry, whatever remained of Elijah Coombs's family, and learned that his widow, a woman named Sarah Coombs, had left Cedar Bend not long after the disaster, unable to bear raising her daughter beneath the weight of a ruined name, and now lived a quiet, modest life in a town some 40 miles distant, still believing, so far as anyone could determine, that her husband's memory carried a guilt Delphine now knew to be entirely false. It did not take long for word to reach Horace Kell that the widow he had so recently dispossessed was living down at the old landing, patching together a derelict barge and asking careful questions about a disaster 11 years past, and his reaction, once he understood the direction of her inquiries, carried none of the confident, respectable warmth he had displayed before the county judge. He came to the landing himself one gray afternoon and offered, with a smoothness Delphine now recognized as precisely the same practiced falsehood she had heard in his testimony against her own claim, to purchase the ruined barge back from her at several times what she had paid, framing it as a simple kindness toward a widow struggling with a hulk far too costly for her to properly maintain. Delphine, who had spent 13 years reading small discrepancies out of her husband's ledgers, recognized the offer immediately for what it was and declined it with a courtesy that revealed nothing of what she had already found. His tone shifted considerably once refused. Within days, a rumor began moving through Cedar Bend that the widow Archer had been seen removing county auction salvage without proper authorization, an accusation vague enough to trouble the sheriff without ever quite resolving into a formal charge, and separately, several of the dockhands and clerks who had shown her early kindness grew suddenly distant, their own livelihoods too closely tied to Kell's bank and its mortgages on nearly every warehouse along the river to risk his displeasure. Defending a stranger's old grievance. One evening a note arrived at the dockmaster's house where Delphine still lodged, and signed and carefully vague, suggesting that a woman with so little standing left in Cedar Bend ought to think carefully about how quickly the goodwill of neighbors could be withdrawn from someone who made a habit of stirring up old griefs better left to rest. Delphine read it twice by lamplight and set it aside without answering, understanding it for exactly the kind of pressure her father had once warned her men applied when the truth beneath their surface story grew too close to breaking through. For a difficult stretch of weeks, Delphine found herself exactly where a woman uncovering an old, inconvenient truth so often finds herself, alone, doubted, and facing a family whose banking fortune and civic standing dwarfed her own single trunk and a drowned pilot's careful logbook. But she had, after all, spent her whole life learning that the river never lies about what lies beneath it, whatever men reading its surface might prefer to believe, and she understood that Coombs's logbook, however damning, would need corroboration and public attention to survive contact with a family as thoroughly established as the Pruitts and Kells had become. She wrote first and most carefully to Sarah Coombs, sending a careful transcription of her husband's final entries, and received in return a letter so full of disbelieving, grateful relief that Delphine understood at once she had found, in Sarah, someone with every reason to see the matter properly through at last. She approached, next, the editor of the regional river trade newspaper that circulated among the towns along that stretch of the Mississippi, a man with no particular loyalty to the Pruitt or Kell families and a professional appetite for a genuinely remarkable story of old river history, who agreed to examine the logbook and the original commission findings himself before committing to anything, and who came away, after careful review, convinced enough of the pattern to begin his own pointed inquiries. And she sought out, finally, two of the surviving deckhands' families who had lost fathers and brothers in the same disaster. Families who, once shown Coombs's own careful account of his repeated warnings, found in it not merely vindication for a wrongly blamed pilot, but a long overdue explanation for losses they had carried, unexplained and unresolved, for over a decade. The newspaper's eventual story, running under a headline recalling a pilot's long-buried logbook and a disaster's true cause, could not be dismissed the way Kell and the Pruitt family plainly hoped it would be, for it arrived supported by Coombs's own careful record in his own hand, by Sarah Coombs's independent testimony about her husband's character and repeated warnings, and by the glaring absence of any safety complaint whatsoever in the original commission's published findings, an absence any careful reader could now see for the convenient omission it had always been. Public attention, once roused, proved considerably harder for the Pruitt family's descendants and their banking relations to manage than a single widow's private accusation had been, and the State River Commission, its interest sharpened by the newspaper's inquiries and by the surviving deckhands' families now openly petitioning for a formal re-examination, reopened the 11-year-old case with a thoroughness the original hurried investigation had never applied. Silas Pruitt himself had been dead some years and could face no personal accounting. But the reopened investigation concluded, based on Coombs's logbook and the corroborating absence of any prior safety record, that the disaster had indeed resulted from the barge owner's documented refusal to authorize necessary boiler repairs, formally and publicly clearing Elijah Coombs's name of any responsibility for the tragedy that had claimed his own life alongside those of three deckhands. Horace Kell's own forged loan agreement against Delphine came under fresh and immediate scrutiny once the newspaper's inquiries turned toward the broader Pruitt-Kell family history of convenient documents and confident denials, and a handwriting examiner engaged from St. Louis found Thomas's supposed signature on the loan agreement considerably less convincing than the county judge had originally judged it to be, especially once compared directly against 13 years of genuine signatures, preserved in Delphine's own carefully kept freight ledgers. Facing the near certainty of a formal fraud charge that the newspaper's continued attention made politically impossible for the county to simply ignore, Kell agreed to a quiet settlement restoring to Delphine the full value of her husband's freight office, its warehouse, and its two skiffs, along with a public retraction of his original claim against her. Delphine did not stop at simple restitution. Working alongside Sarah Coombs, who returned to Cedar Bend for the first time in 11 years once the matter was properly settled, and alongside the families of the deckhands who had died in the same disaster, Delphine helped establish, using a portion of her restored freight office earnings along with a modest settlement the River Commission ordered from the remaining Pruitt family holdings, a permanent memorial fund for river workers' families, meant to provide swift, transparent support to any household suddenly left without a wage earner due to the river's ordinary hazards, administered by a small committee of working rivermen rather than any single owner, precisely the kind of safeguard that might have spared Elijah Coombs's own family so many years of undeserved shame had it existed sooner. The old Cordelia herself, the barge Delphine had bought for $8 because nothing else in the world was left to her. She restored plank by careful plank over the following seasons, and turned into a modest floating cargo office and way station for the smaller river traders still working that stretch of the Mississippi, her hull bearing, once again and now rightfully, the name every soul in Cedar Bend remembered, though for a truth entirely different from the one they had carried for 11 long years. And so it was that Delphine Archer, 39 years old, cast out by a forged debt and left with $8 sewn into the lining of her shawl, became the reason a drowned pilot's ruined name was finally restored, and an entire town's understanding of its own worst tragedy was finally set right. The barge that no one at that county auction had thought worth a second bid had carried, sealed behind its false ballast boards, not merely a dead man's careful record, but 11 years of patient, waiting truth, requiring only a hand careful enough to notice a seam that did not sit quite flush with the boards around it. Delphine had inherited her father's conviction that the river never lies about what lies beneath it, whatever men reading its surface prefer to believe, and it had cost her a marriage's worth of security before it finally gave back, not to her alone, but to an entire river community, a debt owed since 1875, and a good name restored to a family that had waited 11 years to hear it spoken plainly. She had paid $8 for an abandoned river barge. It would turn out the barge, and the truth it had been quietly guarding in its flooded hold all those years, had simply been waiting for the one person patient enough to read what lay beneath its surface, exactly as her father had once taught her to read the river itself. We tell you Delphine's story not merely because a hidden logbook and a drowned pilot's vindication make for a satisfying discovery, though they certainly do, but because of what she chose to do once that discovery was entirely hers to keep or to share. She could have quietly restored her own fortunes and said nothing further of Elijah Coombs's logbook at all, and given everything that had been taken from her, few in her position could have been blamed for choosing exactly that. Instead, she spent her hard-won evidence clearing a drowned stranger's 11-year-old name and building from a half-sunk barge nobody wanted, a fund meant to catch the very kind of family her own investigation had shown could otherwise be left to carry an undeserved shame for a lifetime. That choice, more than the barge, more than the logbook, and more than the $8 that started it all, is the true inheritance of this story, the understanding that the surface of any story, like the surface of any river, can look calm and settled while hiding an entirely different truth beneath it, and that patient, careful attention is very often the only honest way to finally pay a debt that someone else has left unpaid for far too long. Thank you for spending this time with Delphine and the river barge that kept a good man's name safe for 11 years. For more incredible true-to-life stories of courage, mystery, and justice, hit subscribe and join our growing community. If her story stayed with you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs the reminder that patience and careful attention can outlast even the most comfortable lie, and we would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already decided to write off? We read every one of them, and we are always glad to have you here with us. Until next time, stay close.